Hello, this is Infoside here with another edition of Radio Infoside. We're going to talk about my top 10 global stability threats that the world faces in 2017. Let's jump right in. First up, we have the Syrian conflict. I really think that this evolved out of the Arab Spring plan to overthrow various Islamic nations in the Middle East. As to what the larger agenda was, I don't know, but there's really compelling evidence that the US, through intelligence agencies, the UK, other European nations, initially funded and started the groups that were related to ISIS. And then they either got away from them or something happened where these groups who were originally funded to get rid of Assad kind of spun off and took a life of their own. And in some ways there's still evidence that they're still being supplied by, you have evidence that Turkey was buying the oil from ISIS. There's pictures of brand new white Toyota trucks running around where, with all our satellite technology and stuff, we should have been able to blow to pieces, but we didn't until Russia came, and then Russia took care of them. There were stories early on about the UK special forces and US special forces and other countries. I believe Jordan was in the mix too, with their forces in Syria. And again, I think it was all an effort to get rid of Assad. And, you kind of had somebody spill the beans where you had General Wesley Clark go to the Pentagon and supposedly slipped information that there was a plan to get rid of 7 Middle Eastern nations or overthrow their governments. And then we saw the domino effect, the standard NGO, non-government organizations, used to train, youthful groups, pawns to overthrow their governments. And again, what the larger agenda was, I do not know. I do know that a lot of people had beefs with Assad. Turkey, I think, had legitimate beefs because Assad supported a lot of the Kurdish liberation movements, the PPK, I think they're called, the Kurdish groups that wants to form its own region. Can't blame them. I'm not anti-Kurd. I think they're one of the most pro-Western, pro-US groups in the region. It's just kind of, they're stuck in this horrible position where, they're in part of Iraq, they're in part of Turkey. The US won't fully support the Kurds because it'll make the Turks mad. And, they're just kind of in a bad spot. But anyway, it's just a mess now. Now we have Russia involved. And there was some interesting information how Russia snuck in. They had transport planes flying into Russia, and they would fly their fighters underneath the transport planes in their initial move in there to kind of throw Western intelligence satellite information off. Interesting things like that. I think Russia's there not so much to destroy ISIS. We're there not so much to destroy ISIS. We're there to overthrow Assad and then destroy ISIS, which was our monster that was created to get rid of Assad that's now kind of gotten away from Western stuff, in my opinion. And Russia's there to keep Assad in power and kind of stop ISIS, but more to lessen U.S. influence in the region, gain their own national prestige and their own influence in the region, and again, keep Assad in there. And with all these countries in there, Turkey's now going down and claiming parts of Iraq and Syria as their own, as like a buffer zone. European intelligence and special forces are in there. We're in there. Russia's in there. There's just a whole lot of people in the mix, and with some miscalculations, things could go south. I think with Trump in there, there will be a brief reset between Russian and American our relationships to each other, our relationship to each other. I'm not sure how long that will last, and I'll talk about that more. But I think during that period is the best chance to have some kind of peace in Syria. And I feel really bad for the Syrians. I mean, I'm no fan of Assad, but what went on there and the destruction of the country. I mean, their cities look like this now. That used to be, bustling areas of human activity are now kind of these post-apocalyptic wastelands. I mean, our little ops in there went way, way south, and now it's just this cauldron of bad. And we'll talk more about how that affects things in other points here. Number two, the Islamic colonization of Europe and Africa. We hear all sorts of horrible things about Boko Haram. I think I'm pronouncing it close to right. Doing horrible things in Africa, terrorists in Nigeria going into malls and shooting people up. I expect more of the same of that until various powers that have their finger in there step up. U.S. Special Forces are in the mix. China's in the mix now, and in Africa in a big, big way. And if the Islamists start messing with Chinese interests, they might get surprised that they're treated a little differently than how the West has been ignoring them or only quasi-fighting them in Africa. And then we have what's going on in the UK, what's going on in France, what's going on in Finland and Sweden. We have all these sex crimes, we have no-go zones, we have places that are declaring themselves semi-independent and saying that Sharia law is basically how that area is going to live, regardless of what the local and federal governments in those European nations say. All sorts of sexual abuse, because the people that come in just culturally think that if a woman's out in public, she's like fair game to molest, and just all sorts of problems. And the European governments just seem so politically correct that they cannot meet the challenge. They're just now starting to say, wow, there might be something going on. And let's take a little bit of a look at like what the types of stuff that is going on. You know, we're told by European governments that the immigrants that are coming into the country are women and children that are from Syria, and it's Europe's and America and other countries' duties to help save all these people, and we're not allowed to believe our lying eyes. Where we see, like in this video, it clearly shows. I'm not seeing too many women and children here. These are all combat-aged males. And they're all coming in, rather than defending their country, they're leaving their women and children behind to come essentially colonize Europe. And there's nefarious things going on because NGOs have been caught smuggling European immigrants in kind of shady ways. Zero Hedge had some articles on that recently. Again, we're told these are women and children, but there's so many numerous videos out there. We're not allowed to believe our lying eyes that these are all, that they're not, from Morocco, Algeria, all these other places. And it's a serious problem. It's changing Europe. There's places that I said, women can't go anymore. If they go outside in France, they have to wear burqas. And they can't go into cafes. There's all sorts of rioting. And part of this is Europe's own racism. They like to think that they're progressive and that they can integrate everybody in, so they let all these Islamic migrants in. But in reality, they're not so progressive. So you have one layer of government opening up the floodgates saying, come on in, and you have the lower levels of society saying, well, you can come in, but you got to stay away from everybody over in these little areas. And so those little areas become ghettofied, and then they become fertile grounds for recruiting of terrorists and all sorts of bad. But again, the government seems totally unresponsive to the problem of Islamofascism, Islamic colonization. They're still seeing, with their with their false eyes that all these people that are coming in are, nice women and children, doctors and whatnot, and that's just not the case. They like Sharia, they like the old ways, and they're changing Europe. So it's a problem. And again, I think there's a nefarious element to this. I think that there could be kind of the hidden hand, the deep state, the New World Order, whatever you want to call it, is using immigration. I mean, this is a classic tool from iniquity to destabilize and change cultures. And I think that, there's some pretty compelling evidence. There's a lot of shady stuff going on with this immigration. And it's meant to destabilize Europe. And who and why that's happening, I have some thoughts, but we'll discuss that at a later time. Number 3 is EU fragmentation and the Brexit, the UK leaving the EU. Wow, talking about destabilizing. For one thing, I'll just say right up front, I don't like the European Union. It's very technocratic, it's very bureaucratic, it's somewhat fascist, and it seems to kind of be very centralized at the top, giving bureaucrats power, taking power away from the people, and apparently the English, the UK had the ability to withdraw. And that whole thing seemed kind of suspicious to me. It's like the European elite, they're totally pro European Union in the UK, the ones that live in the UK, and even the ones in the EU. They didn't really full-heartedly fight it. I mean, they put like token resistance in, saying, oh, you guys shouldn't go, all sorts of bad things will happen if you go. But I didn't really see an earnest pushback to keep the UK in the EU. That's just from my limited perspective as an American looking through the internet and reading articles can see. But I'll float one conspiracy theory to you. I think that perhaps the UK was allowed to quasi-leave the EU because the EU wants to go a direction that, with the UK and its stronger democratic traditions, its English law versus Napoleonic law traditions in a lot of European nations, that maybe Brussels, Munich, Germans wanted to do things in the European Union, and the hidden hand in that deep state that I mentioned wanted to take Europe a direction that would be extremely difficult with Britain involved or the UK involved. So they allowed the UK this kind of fake pull out, withdraw, so that they can, do the things that they want to do, which would be politically difficult if the UK was still a bigger voice in the European Union. So they'll give them their space, become more fascist, do what they need to do, and then reel the UK back in, and people will note that the UK never fully deintegrated from the EU, and there was just kind of this token thing to make it look like they were leaving when really they weren't. And this is destabilizing in itself because even if it's not a plot, just elites want to stay in and the average person in the UK voted against it, or the majority did. If the elites, quibble on this too much, I saw people today talking about how there could be a revolution. I don't know if it'll go that far, but it'll further, relations in the UK with citizens against its government are already kind of fragile, and elites not doing the will of the people really disenfranchise the people and cause stability issues in the UK. And also a larger issue, now you have France talking about possibly leaving the UK, you have Italy wanting to do its own exit, and that's all destabilizing. Is the European Union going to survive? I follow a lot of the Balkan countries, and they're still interested in joining and getting things going, and I'll talk more about that too. But if the European fragments, that's huge. And like I said, I'm not a big fan of the European Union. I did do some travel to Eastern Europe recently, spent some time in Bulgaria. And that doesn't mean I'm an expert in European politics or anything. I don't wear like a black turtleneck or wear a black beret and talk about, I've been to Europe, so I'm so enlightened now type of thing. I've seen certain people do. But it did give me some perspective. Even though I don't like the EU, there has to be something there. There has to be some kind of common defense diplomacy thing for all these small little European countries, else they'll just be picked off like Turkey, and we'll talk about them more. They're starting to talk about, like, are these Bulgarian cities really Bulgarian, or do they really belong to Turkey? Are these Greek islands really Greek, or should they be Turkey? All these simmering kind of territorial claims are now live again. And then we have Russia, which we'll talk about, that, all these countries are surrounded by either great, big regional powers like Turkey, or, really big, great powers like Russia. And if they're all on their own, I worry that they'll just be little piranha attacks by these various bigger powers that gobble up Eastern Europe. And, that would be a shame to me. And it could be very destabilizing as well. Is the U.S. going to defend them? Is the U.S. not going to defend them? Are they going to defend themselves? Germany gets sucked in, and the UK does, and then the Americans get sucked in, and we have a wider war. There's definitely things to watch there. I would say, if another country leaves the UK in 2017, that's a really bad sign. Number 4, keeping financial systems operating. I'm not an economic or finance guy, and I really like having this book in my memory, Bankruptcy 1995. This guy here was a little bit off, 2005, 2015, and we're still chugging along. And there's a lot of fear mongering out there. The sky is falling, the dollar's going to collapse, the world's going to be Mad Max, you better go build your bunker type of stuff going on. We're not really seeing that. But what we are seeing is boom and bust cycles. And even though these guys have gotten the date wrong, and again, I don't fully understand money, I won't pretend to, but what little understanding I do have, guys like these, the fundamentals that they're talking about, the problems that they're talking about, are legit. You can't keep borrowing indefinitely. You can't keep printing money out of the ether. I heard one joke about Ben Bernanke. He goes to a pizza place, and the guy says, I forget exactly, I'm going to botch it, but I'll try anyway. How many pieces, how many pieces do you want? And he says, 1, but slice it into 10 pieces because I'm really hungry. I botched the joke. But the idea is the more pieces you create, if those pieces are representative of the economic whole, and the economic whole isn't growing as fast as the pieces, the dollars that you're symbolically creating out of nothing, out of going to bank accounts and adding zeros, then theoretically each little dollar piece should be getting smaller in value because there's more and more and more of them representing back to that one economic pie that isn't really growing that big. That fundamental to me seems like, yeah, that is going to cause problems. And then there's the whole economic shockwaves that we had, where we had these boom and bust cycles. The last one was 2007, where we've had essentially either a really strong recession or a light depression, depending on how you want to look at it. There's no bread lines anymore because everybody just gets an EBT card. But if you look at food stamp usage, we're seeing this huge kind of spike that's just now labeling off. And, other benefits that are given out to keep people afloat. Maybe it's just that things are more hidden. But the economic fundamentals haven't changed. And Trump's coming in, and it's funny, Trump's not even elected, and already he's getting jobs that would have under Obama or Hillary gone overseas. Companies, for political reasons or optimism, whatever you want to call it, blackmail, they're deciding to stay here and make jobs. And that's all good. I think that there will be a turnaround. People might disagree with me, but economically, I think that Trump becoming the president and his trade policies, although there could be conflicts with China, we'll talk more about that too, I think that will create an economic boost. But again, these fundamental problems, the 20 trillion in the federal debt, even if Trump cuts down the yearly budget deficit run by the federal government from over $1 trillion, which under Obama it is now, to say 500 billion, that's still stacking on 500 billion a year to an already incredible amount of debt. And if you factor in supposedly government entitlements, and I forget the terminology, but basically promises to pay people for various benefits, pensions, Medicare and all this stuff, we're looking at down the road like 60 trillion of this stuff that the federal government's going to have to, if it keeps all its obligations, pay out. And that fundamental isn't going away. And then we also have, if I can find it here, we have this type of thing. Currency wars, Trump and China, and we'll talk more about China, could get into it. China's depegging or purposely keeping their currency undervalued so that they sell more products and it hurts other countries' industrial base while it builds theirs is actually a pretty wise policy. But eventually, other countries, including the United States, especially under Trump, are going to cry uncle and say no more of this. And that could be hugely economic destabilizing. Losing my English here. You know, we get in a big currency war. I would argue that we're already in a currency war, so I'm pro fighting it. But at the same time, depending how it's played out, you want to try to fight it softly. You want to give your enemy an opportunity, or let's not use the word enemy. Let's use the word competitor with China and others. You sure you want to do that? You might want to think that through. I mean, you can still get away with a lot of stuff, but not as much stuff as you could, a couple months ago. You got to change. And hopefully their calculus of benefit versus cost analysis will go, okay, we'll change, rather than some big duke it out currency war, trade war type of thing, again, that we're already in. We're just, only one side's fighting it. Hopefully it can be resolved with only minimal friction, but the potential there for damaging the financial system of the world, the United States, China, whatever, is big. And if people's economy gets damaged by another country, they view that as a bad thing and possibly an act of war, and we go on from there. So as much as I think it's a good thing that Trump will be elected and things are looking up, as far as American jobs, there's these other factors, the economic factors that are still there that haven't gone anywhere, that could come back to haunt in various ways. Number 5, healing the rift in American politics. Number 5, healing the rift in American politics. America just had this huge election where not just it was your standard, Democrat versus Republican, but it was also statist versus libertarian, free trade versus fair trade versus economic nationalism. And with the Trump victory, it is a huge change. I don't need to tell you that. And there's just a group of people that have been in power for a long time, and they are just not happy about Trump getting into power, and they are resisting the democratic process. And to make the matters worse, we have this whole generation of millennials. Now, this is a generalization. There's great people that are millennials. There's people that aren't so great. But just as a generation, they were raised in such a way that they're very used to getting their own way. And when they see something that doesn't go their way, they throw a temper tantrum. And basically, they've been psyoped into thinking that conservatives are secretly bigoted, racist, that the Trump victory is all because of various evil collusion going on, and they want to resist that. I'm not sure how easy it's going to be to sell a Trump victory to all these people, and to sell the democratic process where one side wins, the other side loses, there's this peaceful transition of power, and you give the other side a chance before you start raising all sorts of hell. We might just go right to the raising all sorts of hell part. And then we have people like this in the mix, George Soros. And please forgive me, I was remiss. This is take 2 of this video, and I pointed this out in the previous version I did, where there's a little bit of a strange thing going on as far as, and I hinted at it when I covered point 2, the Islamification of Europe, essentially. There's this hidden hand, deep state aspect of it, and some of that is very similar to Operation Gladio type stuff. Operation Gladio was in Europe. NATO got together, and Italy and all, American intelligence said, okay, well, if the Russians conquer Italy, let's set up this network. So we got all these people that are ready to do fifth column activities and really put the hurt on the Warsaw Pact. And they did that. But then the Warsaw Pact never invaded. We were kind of at the standstill with the Cold War. Well, you don't want to let this good capability you have go to waste. So the Italians were kind of flirting with communism and doing a bunch of stuff. So you had this Gladio network start doing terrorist attacks in Italy and blame it on the communists to turn public opinion uh, away. And I think a similar thing's happening with the Islamification to kind of step back in Europe a little bit. I mean, sometimes these terrorists, like the guy who went in and shot the Russian uh, ambassador recently, well, we'll get more into that. But anyway, George Soros is kind of doing this type of stuff through his NGO organizations. He's an expert at destabilizing governments and manipulating them. He did it with Ukraine, and again, I'm not saying that the Russians weren't they're manipulating too. They were. A lot of people forget that. But he's going to try to do the same thing, picking up on the rage of these people to try to stop this guy. And there's a huge potential for problems there. And my hope is that there will be some kind of healing. I'm not optimistic enough to think that everybody's going to get along, but I hope things can be patched up enough so where our political process can limp along without all sorts of riots and protest and all that. I think initially when Trump gets into power, we'll see a surge of that, but I'm really hopeful it'll die down, but it may not. This rift between the Trumpers and the hardcore left could affect everybody in between and could destabilize the American government and the whole world. It's something to pay attention to and watch out for this type of stuff. The NGO manipulations to do things to blame other sides or just cause general instability. Number 6, the lost or drifting away from Western influence of Turkey. Turkey for a long time has been a powerful NATO ally. They were one of the few secular Islamic governments that existed. They have an extremely powerful military. They have a fleet of very modern F-16s. In fact, their airframes are newer and probably better than the F-16s that fly for the U.S. Air Forces, or at least some of them are. I don't know about the avionics, but they've got Leopard 2 Patton tanks, updated M60 tanks with Israeli kits, armor kits that make them pretty lethal. Well-trained military. And what we see with Turkey, and a lot of this has been happening over the years, where Turkey's Islamic population was frustrated with the Second Gulf War, thought America should have never been there, which caused a lot of, well, basically helped the rise of Erdogan. I always pronounce his name wrong. And he is a Turkish politician that is more pro-Islamic. He'll have pictures of Ataturk, which is the father of secular Turkey, up around here. But in his policies currently, he's rewriting the Constitution with the failed Turkish coup. Now, Turkey has this tradition of coups. Basically, since the government secularized, it kind of would let the politicians and the political parties go until they went too far, and then the military would step in, do a reset. Unfortunately, it would be a little bloody, and then turn back over to things back to the civilian governments, kind of similar to what goes on in some Latin American countries. What happened recently is that didn't work out so well. For one, you have a greater presence of a group of pro-Islamic people in Turkey than I think you did before. Number 2 is that Turkey was trying to get into the European Union so much that they didn't want to do anything like have coups and that sort of thing, because the European Union is going to go, no, you guys are a third world country with this kind of third world Latin American style politics of military coups and no respect for the civilian government. So I think the military held off for a real long time. And this allowed Erdogan to rise, and he's rewriting the Constitution so he can take power up and, stay in power up till the 2028 or something like that. And, after the coup failed, you had, basically the secularists were targeted. And, there's been purges in the military, there's been purges in the universities, there's been purges in the bureaucracy to desecularize and weaken the secular element in Turkey, and the Islamists that Erdogan represents are gaining power. And obviously this is destabilizing because it might cause a drift. For one thing, again, the Europeans, thinking they're all progressive, didn't really ever want Turkey to become part of the European Union. It's all been a dog and pony show, in my opinion. So Turkey now realizes that and might start looking to other powers to drift towards. They may not have as much interest in staying with NATO. And it also, again, those territorial ambitions might come back up where they want to, piranha attack and take little bits and pieces off of Bulgaria, Greece, those type of things. So there's flashpoints there with Turkey. There could be additional coups or civil wars in Turkey between the secularists and the Islamists. It drifting with its military towards maybe a more Russian, less NATO-centric sphere of influence has effects on NATO, the West, and everything. Turkey's a key country, and it drifting away from the West is huge and destabilizing. Plus, its military, which is heavily involved in Syria and parts of Iraq, because possibly all the officer purges that went on behind the coup, you have things like this modern Leopard 2 tank being taken out by some ISIS guy with a 10-year-old Russian anti-tank missile, or the crew abandoning it after they see one exploded. They're taking higher casualties than maybe they normally would because their leadership is down. Kind of like what happened with the Russians when Stalin purged the military and then the Germans invaded, and that lack of talent that was purged out of the military really helped the Germans in their initial successes. We could see, bigger blunders in Syria, which might actually cause Turkey to be drawn in more. So there's all that type of stuff to think about. But in the larger role, Turkey has generally an extremely powerful military with modern equipment, modern training, and for us to lose them as an ally. I mean, we haven't lost them yet. They're still part of NATO, but seeing that drift and the internal forces that are going on in Turkey could be very destabilizing for what's going on in Syria, what's going on in the Balkans, how emboldened the Russians are in other areas of the world. This could affect a lot. Number 7, Russian encroachment into the Balkans and possibly other areas. All right. So basically we have Putin, and, Russian foreign policy could be a whole podcast in itself. But they're very active in doing psychological operations in Eastern Europe, tapping into the Russian populations. We've seen them do piranha attacks, like I call them, where they come in and rip off chunks of territory. They've invaded Georgia and taken some provinces away from Georgia. They took the Crimea peacefully, which is pretty amazing, actually. And then went ahead and is still in eastern Ukraine fighting covertly and not so covertly. And I expect more of the same as Putin and the elites of Russia attempt to regain their empire. And basically we have this whole issue of NATO now. With Trump in power, Trump has basically said, and I agree with him, if you guys aren't willing to defend yourselves, why should we defend you? A lot of European countries, notable exceptions, are some of the, like Poland, hardly spend any money on their militaries, and their militaries are kind of a joke. They're kind of, I mean, in one sense I get it, they were part of the Soviet Union or part of the Warsaw Pact, and that fell, their economies tanked, so they couldn't spend a lot of money. But pretty much Russia's resurgent now, and, unless they want to become part of the Russian Federation again, and if they do, if the Eastern European countries, I'm all about the sovereignty of Eastern Europe. If Eastern Europe wants to go that way, and they reach that conclusion on their own, not because of psychological operations, bullying, threats, I'm okay with that. But it seems like Russia's all too willing to do all sorts of underhanded things to take these countries, these quote lesser Slavs, back into Big Brother Slavs' lap and rule over them. I'm all about the Eastern Europeans being free. I think they had this renaissance where even though their economies just tanked there for a while and it was really hard, again, I spent a little bit of time in Bulgaria and that region, and seeing how they're thriving now. I would hate to see that all their freedom, their economic opportunities all crashing because of conflicts between Russia and Europe and them being pawns and all that. And the problem, again, going back to NATO here, is if NATO gets weak, that could invite the Russian bear to come back in militarily into Estonia. Um, you know, Bigger offenses into the Ukraine, other areas, and those are obviously flashpoints. Are we going to defend them or not? Or is Germany going to defend them? And then when Germany does, do we get sucked into it then? There's British forces in the region. What are they going to do? So definitely big flashpoints there. Again, the same hope with Syria, that this honeymoon period between Putin and Trump that I think is going to happen. There's a chance that we might be able to come to some sort of agreements. But I really fear, this is what I fear for the Balkans, is that, there will be these agreements made. Everything's going great. Trump's getting along with Russia. Russia seems to be cooperating and no longer bugging their neighbors too much. I mean, we still detect that their intelligence operations are doing a bunch of stuff, but we largely ignore it because they seem to be going fine. Everything's going fine. Then towards the end of the year, the beginning of next year, boom, out of the blue, big offensive into Ukraine, big offensive into, big moves into Estonia. And another thing Trump's going to face is there's Russian builds up. There's that Kaliningrad, I believe it's called, area kind of up by Estonia, this little Russian enclave where they can put all sorts of missiles in. That gives them all sorts of range to blow up using a first strike, any NATO forces in the area, to wreak havoc with all sorts of missiles, even possible nuclear missiles. And as those buildups happen, is Trump going to ignore them for the sake of good relations, so they get to the point where Russia's like, hey, we got enough power here where we don't think these wussies are going to do anything, and let's take some more territories. And, even we have to step back and say, what are our interests in the region? The Cold War has changed. Our foreign policies remain the same. What are we going to do? And there might be a recalculation there by the Trump administration, and that could leave a lot of these guys sitting at the table here high and dry. I don't know. If I were them, I'd be thinking about that. Number 8, Chinese expansion and adventurism, I guess you could call it. We see Chinese hacking. I mean, look at this. I'll just skip to this. Tell me this is an exact rip-off of the F-35. It cost the U.S. billions of dollars, Lockheed Martin, to develop the F-35. China hacks it for essentially free, saves billions of dollars of research and development. Now, I'm sure this isn't as capable as, say, the F-35. This is the Chinese, I call it the J-31 here. But, if they can produce, 7 or 8 of them for every F-35 we produce, and they also have something that's essentially, and it has one person called it, an F-22, just elongated a little bit with extra fuel, no gold canopy and canards, the little wings here. Other than that, it's an F-22. Again, what do we do? Just hand them the blueprints here? And they're building those as basically missile trucks to fly out and get close to carrier groups before they're detected and launch all sorts of missiles and overwhelm the American defenses if a conflict comes up. And there is possibility of conflict, again, not just because of these guys here wanting to kick U.S. influence out. China wants to build the string of pearls, as they call it, all sorts of little island bases and bases across their allied countries to build up their naval presence, to make the U.S. presence, which is already kind of fading, even though we're doing this reset to me, which, by the way, is ridiculous. We're borrowing billions of dollars from China so that we can spend billions of dollars to defend countries in the Pacific against China. To me, that's not very sustainable. I think the Trump administration, when they get into power, is going to look at that. Um, but anyway, the Chinese military is growing because they get their research and development for free, and they have this huge industrial capability built up by Western greedy nations that were eager to exploit cheap Chinese labor. I could go on about that, but we also have this asymmetric fleet here where the Chinese Coast Guard is really just you know, acts just like their military does, is used to harass local fishing of other countries in disputed territorial waters. And then we have this third Chinese fleet here, the Chinese fishing boat fleet, which is now becoming armed, which totally coordinates with these guys and these guys. So there could be all sorts of flashpoints in the Pacific, or somebody makes a miscalculation, somebody bluffs, somebody calls the bluff when the command and control guys above them didn't want to call their bluff. You know, I think China basically is waiting to see kind of what Trump will do. You know, if China can get away without being challenged and too much changing and just keep building up their military, building for another 20 or 30 years, it's my opinion that they can pretty much just kick America out of this region. It just won't be worth it for America. To counter that, I don't think America really has the financial resources to, you know, they're talking with Trump to build this 350 plus Navy, which I think is a great thing. But at the same time, you know, with China, with all these island bases, you can just stack hundreds of cruise missiles on those bases. And unless the technology we have for rail guns and lasers gets really ultra tech, you know, whatever ships we send there can just be overwhelmed by planes carrying tons of cruise missiles that sneak up and just launch. So, you know, again, China can also do currency manipulation. You know, there could be a flash war that comes out of the blue between China and India. They have territorial disputes. So definitely eyes on China. I think already before Trump's even in office, there's already tension growing. So this one, maybe I put it at 8. Maybe it should be more like, you know, number 5 or number 4 as far as potential threats. Number 9, the Great Wealth Divide. You know, this is a global problem. And, you know, I'm not a communist, I'm not a socialist, I'm not really into wealth redistribution. But when the haves and the have-nots, that separation between them all, historically, and when it gets too great, it tends to be destabilizing. And we see certain segments of the global population, or the population here in America, if we're talking America specifically, has opportunities to all sorts of innovation and can take part of it and invest in it, where the dupes down here aren't really in a position to take advantage of that, and it's creating huge inequities. So this is a problem. You know, as these inequities get huge, the people over here start going, they start calling these people useless eaters, and we don't need these people anymore. And these people say, we're being exploited by this group over here, and there tends to be tension. And the way I think we deal with it is, we need to end a lot of the crony capitalism stuff, like TARP, say. We talked about that with the financial stuff. There was this nice little scam where the Federal Reserve would buy troubled assets, and they'd buy it at a rate of like $40 billion a month, where banks had all these investments that they considered bad. So they cried to the Federal Reserve, I've got all this property here that's a bad investment, it's underwater, you know, take it off my hands. So the Federal Reserve, at the tune of $40 billion a month, would buy it. And for all I know, that program's still going on. I don't know. But this is 2008, 2009-ish, while everybody's losing their homes, and we were told that this $700 billion investment in TARP would be to help people with troubled mortgages, but less than 3% of that actually went to people with troubled mortgages. The rest of it went who knows where. To foreign banks to stabilize them. Supposedly they paid us the money back, did they? I don't know. There's no real accounting in the Federal Reserve. We don't know what really went on. So there, and the Federal Reserve would take those assets and then sell them at a fire sale price just to kind of get rid of them, because after all, they can create $40 billion by just going to a bank account that they have and adding a couple zeros to the money that's there. It's just wealth out of the air. And then they take that 40 billion, buy these troubled assets, and then sell them back to investors. And a lot of those investors were getting loans to buy these troubled assets from the very same banks that sold them, and they'd get them at a fire sale. And essentially what it was is a giant wealth transfer, going from people who were in a position to take advantage of the zero interest rate that the Federal Reserve had, crony connections to get first picks on these assets that were going belly up. We're in a financial position to take advantage of things where all these suckers down here weren't. So, and again, there's this whole crony capitalism thing too, where there's insider trading, insider information. This group knows, when Silicon Valley is going to make these big innovations, or some other countries, they get first dibs on investments, and then it kind of trickles down to these guys over here, where they get some of that in their 401ks and on down. So my recommendations for dealing with that is to cut down the crony capitalism, which is going to be really hard. I think Trump will do some good there. And we got to get educational opportunities going. We've got to fix our school system so that we have less people that are unskilled, that aren't really making that much money, that are kind of stuck working 2 or 3 part-time jobs and just kind of living day to day. I guess I might qualify that in some ways, and can't take advantage of all the great innovation and investing in it that all the guys over here can. That's one thing. And fixing crony capitalism, having an education system that actually works are 2 solutions to the problem. But I really don't know how to fix it. And to make matters worse, we're going to come up on my final point, which is point 10. And that point is automation. Now, automation's basically, I got to tell you, as a programmer, I didn't think they'd be able to pull off self-driving cars. Now, I thought they'd get the detection and collision programming algorithms worked out fine, and the mapping, the path finding, the waypoints, all that stuff. I thought over time they'd be able to accomplish that. The rapidity of it kind of surprised me. But I didn't think the political aspects of it would really make it a thing, where a car, because these first generation of self-driving vehicles, there's going to be issues where, what happens if it can't avoid something? How does it prioritize what it hits and what it doesn't? There's going to be things that come up that people haven't thought about. I mean, hey, there's brilliant programmers working on it, but it's just a whole new technology. There's going to be bugs, and unfortunately, when you're talking about vehicles that are moving, 60, 70 miles an hour, probably the first ones are going to be in areas where maybe they're not on the freeway, but when you get trucking lanes and stuff like that, people are going to die. And I thought there would be a much greater resistance to automating driving than there is. And then there's this stuff where a lot of automation is happening where you don't necessarily hear about it. It's not announced. This guy, I forget, a couple years ago I was watching this, where this guy got a call from a telemarketer, and as he's talking, he realized that this telemarketer wasn't a real person. It was AI. And it was so good it fooled him. And so he started asking off-the-wall questions to this person. And even then, the AI was still pretty good. Like, it wouldn't answer, but it would answer in such a way, like, I don't understand. And it took him a little while to figure it out. The voice was clear. The inflection was clear. So automation, I think that Trump being elected and his trade policies, there is the real potential for a sort of renaissance where jobs do come back to the U.S., where there's a lot of investment. We already see investment in construction in the United States before Trump even comes into office, going to a 10-year high. People that are pro-Obama might say, well, that's just, Obama's policy's finally taken root and has nothing to do with Trump. I don't want to get into that. I'm just saying there are positive signs. But against those positive signs is automation. I don't think this will be an overwhelming thing. That's why it's at number 10 here for 2017. But as we go on to 2018, 2019, 2020, beyond, just more and more jobs, even in 2017, that you maybe didn't think about are going to be automated. And it's going to put pressure on society. Like, what are we going to do when there's more and more people who don't have jobs? And so, yeah, it's going to be this downward pressure on employment. I mean, some countries are already playing around with the idea of a basic guaranteed income, which at first sounds good, but I think might have unintended long-term financial consequences. And again, we have elites saying, let's just kill all the useless people. And, automation is just getting crazy. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist throwing this in. This whole aspect of it. So again, this is just going to be this trend that continues out, that changes the world over time. We're seeing the initial stages of that gaining steam in 2017. So there you have it. Those are my top 10 global stability threats for 2017 list. I'd love to hear your comments, critiques, hate mail, love mail, whatever. My website, which pretty much is just skin and bones right now, nothing good at all, is radioinfoside.com, but I am adding things to it here and there, building it up from scratch. So hopefully by the end of the year it'll be good and useful. Twitter, you can send a tweet to me at Infoside. YouTube, this video will probably be posted at Infoside 2010. Thanks a lot for watching. And I like to end everything I do with a plug for Christianity. If you're not interested in that, I guess you can stop right here, but I'll make it really quick. We see the world, all these things happening, things that aren't on this list that could come up. But at the same time, the world could also get a lot better where none of these things happen. And actually, I'm more concerned, I guess you could say, that, we have all the pieces on the table of what the Bible kind of shows as an end time scenario. And I could get into that on another podcast and video. But they're all there. But then all of a sudden, so the Bible says you'll know the season when these things are happening. And we see the season. We see the constant encroachment of a surveillance society. We see the technology for the mark of the beast. We see regions of the world forming which could one day kind of mirror the Club of Rome's concept of the 10 kingdoms, which mirrors the Bible end time prophecy of 10 kings, 3 of them overthrown, and then the rise of the Antichrist type of thing. But things could get better. The Bible also says that Jesus will come back at a time when you don't expect him. So we could have, even though all the pieces are on the table and the technology and the underlying progression to building these zones or regions of the world continue to go on, there could be a renaissance where things kind of get better and people kind of go back to their businesses of, just like in the days of Noah, people were marrying, eating, doing their daily thing, not thinking anything was going to happen. And boom, same thing could happen now in the future, where Jesus comes back at a time when you do not expect him to come back. So I beg anyone who watches this to really consider Jesus, consider the fact that he said that, compared to the perfect law of God, we all fall short, all are sinners, all guilty before God. And God is just to condemn us, but he doesn't want to. He loves us enough that he sent his only son, Jesus, to A, show us how to live, and then B, die in our place and pay for the sins of the world. So now it's no longer, are we good enough? Because we're not. It's whether we put our faith in Jesus or not, which restores our relationship to an eternal God who loves us. So I hope you will consider that. I'll stop there. If you have any questions about that, comments, or anything else, radioinfoside.com, Twitter, @Infoside, YouTube, Infoside 2010. I forgot, email too, at infoside@radioinfoside.com. Infoside spelled with the Y here. Technically, it should be an I. Anyway, I really appreciate you watching. Again, pray for peace. Hope that this stuff doesn't happen. But keep an eye on it all. Take care.